The drive from Richmond to the historic estate outside Charlottesville took just over an hour, but the closer I got, the heavier the air felt inside the car. I am Avery, 34 years old, and I was pulling up to my brother's wedding completely alone, bracing myself to break a 15-year streak of absolute dead silence with my mother. I did not even make it past the welcome plaza. Before I could sign the guest book, she intercepted me, physically blocking the arched entryway. There was no polite, fake smile for the surrounding guests. No tearful, long-lost reunion. Standing right in front of a dozen early arrivals, she looked me up and down with raw, unfiltered disgust. "Do not flatter yourself thinking you belong here," she announced, her voice echoing sharply across the cobblestone courtyard. "Without pity, no one would invite you." The quiet chatter around us instantly died. Strangers stared, waiting for me to break. My pulse hammered violently against my ribs, but 15 years of distance had taught me better than to give her the satisfaction of a public screaming match. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not cry. I simply held her gaze, adjusted my clutch, and walked straight past her shoulder, stepping firmly into the grand foyer of the estate. Let her sit with her own bitterness. But as I walked toward the ballroom, I quickly realized her cruel greeting was the least of my problems tonight. If this story touches you and you know what it is like to survive toxic family dynamics, please like, subscribe, and comment your city and your local time down below. I read every single comment. Inside the grand ballroom with its tall windows and original wooden beams, the string quartet played quietly while guests in formal wear moved between the bar and the terrace. My mother had evidently abandoned her post at the entrance to manage my presence inside, quickly steering me toward a cluster of distant relatives and elite country club acquaintances. Her introductions were masterclasses in passive aggression, offering nothing but my name and a tight, bloodless smile that signaled I was a burden to be tolerated rather than a daughter to be welcomed. I endured the stiff nods and judgmental side glances, sipping a glass of sparkling water while the group actively excluded me from their animated conversation about offshore stock portfolios. The blatant ostracization was deeply exhausting, but just before I could excuse myself to find a quiet corner, an enthusiastic voice cut through the pretentious chatter. "Dr. Avery, I thought that was you." I turned to see Dr. Noah Bennett navigating eagerly through the dense crowd with a genuine beaming smile. Noah had completed his grueling residency under my direct supervision a few years ago at the Metropolitan Hospital, and had since become a highly sought-after, brilliant surgeon in his own right. He stopped in front of our circle, completely ignoring the bewildered stares of my mother's friends, and extended a warm, eager handshake. "It is such an immense honor to see you here," Noah said loudly enough for the surrounding group to hear clearly, his tone dripping with profound professional reverence. "We still use your innovative surgical protocols in the trauma wing every single day, and the current batch of residents are practically terrified of trying to match the flawless standard you set." He turned slightly toward my mother and her rigid companions, his enthusiasm unwavering. "You all must be incredibly proud of her. She is an absolute legend in the surgical department." The awkward silence that immediately followed was deafening. My mother's jaw tightened so hard I genuinely thought her teeth might shatter, her carefully constructed mask of superiority slipping entirely to reveal raw, unadulterated annoyance. She hated that a respected, sharply dressed young man was publicly validating my existence, elevating my status in a room where she had explicitly designed me to be the lowest priority. She managed a strained, unconvincing hum of acknowledgement before abruptly turning her back, dragging her friends into a loud discussion about the imported floral arrangements just to intentionally cut Noah off. I watched her rigid, furious posture and then let my gaze sweep slowly across the opulent ballroom, taking in the whispering relatives, pointing subtly in my direction, the averted eyes of cousins I used to play with, and the cold social barrier my family had erected around themselves. Noah's genuine praise was a comforting balm, a sharp reminder of the successful life and profound respect I had painstakingly built outside these suffocating walls, but standing right there amid the expensive silk dresses and sparkling crystal chandeliers, the crushing reality was brutally clear. I could be a renowned surgeon, a dedicated mentor, and a respected medical leader anywhere else in the world, but in this specific venue, among these particular people, I would only ever be the completely isolated and permanently unwelcome outsider. Later, while standing near one of the tall windows overlooking the garden, my mind went back to the last time I had stood in front of that house in Richmond. The memory was permanently seared into my brain like a deep, physical scar, an unyielding reminder of the exact moment my family fractured beyond repair. Two heavy suitcases sat on the front porch, packed hastily after the final, earth-shattering argument regarding my future. My mother had laid out a terrifyingly rigid ultimatum, demanding I abandon my medical school ambitions to take my preordained place in her rapidly expanding commercial real estate empire. When I flatly refused to sacrifice my true calling just to sell luxury condos, she pointed a manicured finger toward the street and ruthlessly declared that if I walked away from her legacy, I was walking away with nothing. I vividly remember the oppressive summer heat pressing heavily on my shoulders as I dragged my worn luggage down the long concrete driveway, completely cut off from financial support, familial love, and the only secure home I had ever known. The subsequent years were a brutal, unending test of sheer, raw survival. I traded the guaranteed comfort of inherited wealth for a cramped basement studio apartment and a punishing daily schedule that left me physically aching. Between rigorous biology lectures and intensive anatomy labs, I worked exhausting overnight shifts waiting tables at a grimy 24-hour diner, tutored struggling undergraduates in chemistry, and picked up tedious weekend transcription gigs just to keep the electricity turned on and cover the skyrocketing tuition fees. Every single dollar earned felt like a monumental victory against the suffocating fear of total failure, fueling a burning fire in my chest to prove I could definitively succeed on my own terms. Through all the intense sleep deprivation and constant financial panic, the absolute heaviest burden to bear was the agonizing, prolonged silence from my brother. On the fateful day of my banishment, Brandon had sprinted out to the curb, tears streaming uncontrollably down his flushed face as he desperately gripped my hand and promised we would figure out a way to secretly stay connected. He was so deeply devastated by the sudden rupture in our household, but our mother mercilessly intercepted the goodbye, forcefully yanking him backward toward the heavy oak door. She explicitly forbade him from calling, texting, or even acknowledging my existence, dominating his environment until the sheer, oppressive weight of her psychological control severed our sibling bond entirely. I stubbornly sent handwritten letters that were returned unopened and left voicemails that never received a reply, eventually realizing that protecting my own sanity meant finally accepting the brutal reality of my isolation. The force of being so callously discarded could have crushed my spirit, but instead, it forged an impenetrable steel armor around my heart. I built my medical career brick by painful brick, relying solely on my own resilience while actively burying the lingering grief of losing the sweet boy who used to look up to me. Looking out at the manicured hedges now, bathed softly in the fading twilight of the estate grounds, the initial sharp sting of that ancient rejection felt distant, replaced by a fierce pride in the independent life I had clawed out of the ashes. When the main course was being served, Brandon stood up at the head table and took the microphone from the band leader. The cheerful clinking of silverware against fine china gradually subsided as the guests turned their attention toward the groom. He looked incredibly sharp in his tailored black tuxedo, but his hands were trembling slightly as he adjusted the heavy metal stand. He did not start with the expected light-hearted anecdotes about how he met his beautiful new bride, nor did he offer any humorous jokes to warm up the crowd. Instead, he took a very deep, shaky breath and asked everyone in the venue to travel back in time with him to a terrifyingly dark Tuesday afternoon, exactly 7 years ago. The festive atmosphere instantly shifted into somber attention as he spoke about the catastrophic structural collapse at the downtown commercial development site, a high-stakes project he had been personally overseeing. A gigantic steel support beam had unexpectedly given way, trapping him beneath thousands of pounds of jagged metal and concrete debris. Brandon vividly described the frantic ambulance ride, the blinding agony, and the incredibly grim prognosis delivered by the initial team of emergency room doctors, who bluntly told him he would likely never walk again, assuming his vital organs even survived the night. Then, his voice cracked with raw emotion, and his gaze bypassed the hundreds of faces to lock directly onto mine across the expansive room. He told the captivated, breathless audience that a top-tier specialist was emergency airlifted from a neighboring state to take over his highly critical, seemingly hopeless case. He detailed how a brilliant, fearless trauma surgeon spent 11 grueling, meticulous hours in the operating theater, reconstructing his violently shattered spine, relieving the dangerous pressure on his spinal cord, and painstakingly stabilizing his severe internal hemorrhaging. The well-dressed guests hung on his every word, blissfully unaware of the stunning revelation that was rapidly approaching. Without breaking eye contact with me, Brandon raised his arm and pointed firmly in my direction. He boldly announced to the gathered elite, the corporate partners, and the extended relatives that the renowned medical professional who pulled him back from the absolute brink of death, the heroic woman who miraculously ensured he could stand upright at his own wedding today, was none other than his heavily ostracized sister. A heavy, profoundly shocked silence instantly blanketed the sprawling venue. You could literally hear a pin drop on the polished hardwood floor. Every single eye in the room shifted frantically between the microphone and my secluded seat. Sitting directly to Brandon's right, our mother, Patricia, turned entirely to stone. Her crystal wine glass hovered frozen inches from her mouth, her knuckles turning bone white as all the color rapidly drained from her normally confident face. Brandon wholly ignored the palpable tension radiating from her and raised his beverage glass high into the air. With tears shining brightly under the warm lights, he stated with unwavering clarity that he owed his very life to me. The applause had barely started when a sudden commotion broke out near one of the side tables. The clapping abruptly faltered, replaced by a sharp, terrified shriek that violently pierced the lingering tension hanging heavy in the ballroom. I immediately tracked the agonizing sound to the beautifully decorated section reserved exclusively for the bride's immediate family. Douglas Grant, Jenna's father, was aggressively clutching his neck, his heavy wooden chair toppling backward with a loud, disruptive crash as he collapsed entirely onto the intricately patterned carpet. He was a robust, usually vibrant older gentleman, but in mere seconds, his normally healthy complexion had morphed into a horrifying, deeply mottled shade of purple. Deep, guttural wheezing escaped his lips as he violently gasped for oxygen that his rapidly swelling airways simply would not allow in. His frantic wife dropped to her knees beside him, her trembling hands hovering uselessly over his chest, while she screamed hysterically for somebody to call an ambulance right away. A nearby, pale-faced waiter dropped a silver serving tray, scattering delicate porcelain plates and revealing the terrible culprit, an unexpected, hidden garnish of pulverized shellfish seamlessly infused into the exotic signature sauce of the catered main dish. Douglas was visibly experiencing a severe, rapidly progressing state of anaphylactic shock, a catastrophic allergic reaction that was systematically and ruthlessly shutting down his entire respiratory system. Complete, unadulterated chaos instantly engulfed the surrounding dining area. Wealthy corporate executives and poised socialites shoved clumsily against each other in blind panic, completely abandoning their carefully cultivated, refined composure. A few frantic guests held up their glowing cell phones, shouting conflicting directions to confused emergency operators. But absolutely no one actually stepped forward to offer any tangible, practical medical assistance. I glanced quickly around and saw that Noah was unfortunately trapped on the completely opposite end of the massive hall, physically blocked from reaching the victim by a dense, impenetrable wall of terrified, frantically moving bodies. Time was evaporating into thin air, cruelly measured in the erratic, terrifyingly shallow spasms of a dying man's chest. Without a single second of hesitation or doubt, my deeply ingrained professional instincts completely overrode the lingering emotional exhaustion of the evening's earlier confrontations. I shoved my heavy mahogany chair back forcefully, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the polished floorboards, and sprinted directly into the chaotic epicenter of the mounting hysteria. I aggressively pushed past two paralyzed groomsmen and firmly ordered the pressing crowd to back away immediately, projecting my voice with the absolute, unquestionable authority of a seasoned medical professional accustomed to commanding high-stakes trauma bays. Sliding swiftly onto the hard floor right next to Douglas, I expertly assessed his rapidly failing vital signs, grimly noting his clammy, cold skin and the dangerously faint pulse fluttering erratically beneath my fingertips. He was rapidly entering the final critical window before total cardiac arrest claimed him. I locked eyes directly with the weeping mother of the bride and demanded to know the exact location of his epinephrine auto-injector, my commanding tone leaving absolutely zero room for hesitation, panic, or delay. I reached Douglas before anyone else could react properly. His frantic wife fumbled through her designer clutch with trembling fingers, finally retrieving the cylindrical plastic EpiPen and shoving it blindly into my outstretched palm. Without wasting a fraction of a second, I uncapped the device, gripped his thigh, and drove the needle forcefully through the thick fabric of his tailored trousers. I held it firmly in place, counting out the agonizing seconds as the vital dose of epinephrine deployed directly into his muscle tissue. The surrounding circle of elite guests pressed inward, their panicked murmurs creating a suffocating wall of noise, so I shot a fiercely commanding glare at a paralyzed groomsman and ordered him to aggressively push the crowd back to give my patient essential oxygen. Once the area was relatively clear, I tossed the used injector aside and immediately positioned my hands on either side of Douglas's jaw, meticulously tilting his head backward to maximize the airflow through his rapidly constricting windpipe. His chest was still heaving in violent, terrifying spasms, so I pressed my fingers deeply into the carotid artery at his neck, meticulously monitoring the dangerously erratic rhythm of his failing heart. Every eye in that opulent room was rigidly fixated on my movements, witnessing the stark contrast between their helpless, frantic hysteria and my practiced, clinical composure. This was my absolute domain, the high-stakes environment where I operated with absolute certainty, and I completely tuned out the horrified gasps of the onlookers to focus entirely on the physical mechanics of survival. I quietly but firmly instructed Jenna, who had just dropped to her knees beside us in her pristine white wedding gown, to hold her father's hand and speak to him in a calm, soothing cadence to lower his skyrocketing heart rate. Slowly, agonizingly, the powerful medication began to counteract the lethal allergic response. The terrifying, high-pitched wheezing gradually softened into deeper, more consistent breaths, and the horrifying purplish tint creeping up his neck slowly receded, replaced by a pale but stable living complexion. His eyes fluttered open, wild with residual fear, but I maintained a steady, reassuring grip on his shoulder, keeping him safely grounded on the floor so he would not exert any unnecessary energy. In the distance, the faint, wailing sound of approaching sirens finally cut through the heavy silence of the estate, growing steadily louder until flashing emergency lights illuminated the massive glass windows. When the team of local paramedics rushed through the arched front doors, carrying heavy trauma bags and a collapsible stretcher, I smoothly intercepted their lead medic. I delivered a rapid, highly precise medical handover, detailing his initial catastrophic symptoms, the exact timeline of his vital signs, the precise dosage of epinephrine administered, and his heavily improved current respiratory status. The EMTs nodded with profound professional respect, immediately transferring Douglas onto their mobile gurney and securely hooking him up to a portable oxygen tank before efficiently wheeling him out toward the waiting ambulance. After the paramedics took Douglas away, the atmosphere in the ballroom changed completely. The frantic, chaotic energy that had just consumed the venue dissolved into a subdued, deeply reflective murmur. The guests were no longer panicking. Instead, they were actively processing the profound shift in the evening's social dynamics. I glanced toward the head table and noticed Patricia sitting remarkably stiff in her oversized, ornate chair. The same elite socialites, influential politicians, and affluent business partners who had eagerly flocked to her side just a few hours prior were now strategically creating a wide, highly uncomfortable radius around her position. They deliberately averted their gazes, pretending to be intensely engrossed in adjusting their silk ties or inspecting their half-empty crystal champagne flutes whenever she attempted to catch their eye. The absolute authority and unquestioned reverence she usually commanded within these wealthy circles had fundamentally shattered. Meanwhile, the physical space around me began to fill with a steady, deliberate stream of attendees. An older woman in a stunningly beaded silver gown, who had previously glared at me with open disdain during the cocktail hour, hesitantly reached out to touch my forearm. She offered a remarkably sincere, almost tearful expression of profound gratitude, quietly confessing how deeply ashamed she felt for blindly trusting the viciously toxic narratives spun about my character over the past decade and a half. Several other prominent individuals quickly followed her lead, organically forming a respectful queue just to shake my hand or murmur earnest, heartfelt apologies. They openly praised the swift, decisive professional actions they had just witnessed firsthand, acknowledging that without my immediate, fearless intervention, the lavish celebration would have inevitably ended in an unthinkable, catastrophic tragedy. It was incredibly validating to watch the meticulously crafted, malicious illusion of the rebellious, selfishly ungrateful daughter completely disintegrate right before their watchful eyes. Before I could become too overwhelmed by the sudden influx of positive attention, Brandon smoothly navigated his way through the growing crowd. He entirely abandoned the traditional groom's protocol of formally mingling with his extended new in-laws to deliberately seek me out. He wrapped a strong, reassuringly heavy arm around my shoulders, his entire posture radiating an immense, protective pride. He actively pulled his closest university buddies, trusted fraternity brothers, and high-level professional colleagues directly into our intimate circle. He enthusiastically and repeatedly introduced me to each of them, distinctly emphasizing my title and presenting me not as some estranged, problematic relative, but as his exceptionally brilliant sister and his ultimate personal hero. He ensured that every single person he valued within his adult life knew exactly who I was and the sheer magnitude of the obstacles I had overcome. Through the shifting bodies of my brother's cheerful, welcoming companions, I caught one final, revealing glimpse of the defeated matriarch. Patricia was now entirely isolated at the expansive, extravagantly decorated main table, aggressively gripping a white linen napkin until her knuckles bruised as she stared blankly down at the untouched imported caviar in front of her. Absolutely no one stepped forward to offer her any semblance of comfort, conversation, or solidarity. The breathtakingly expensive event she had ruthlessly weaponized to showcase her ultimate superiority had spectacularly backfired, leaving her bitterly stranded on a cold, solitary island of her own making. I found my mother near the terrace doors, her face pale and her hands gripping the back of a chair. The heavy, dark velvet curtains framed her diminishing figure, making her look surprisingly fragile compared to the towering, domineering presence she had so aggressively projected at the Welcome Plaza just a few hours prior. I stopped a few feet away from her, feeling the cool, refreshing night breeze slipping quietly through the partially open glass panes, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the expansive gardens below. She stubbornly refused to meet my eyes initially, her gaze fixed intensely on the shadows outside, perhaps frantically searching her calculating mind for a way to rewrite the humiliating social narrative she was now permanently trapped in. I did not raise my voice, nor did I adopt the anxious, defensive posture she always anticipated and exploited during our past teenage arguments. Instead, I spoke with a quiet, unshakable calm that seemed to unnerve her far more than any screaming match ever could. I told her that despite the excruciating foundational pain she caused when she ruthlessly banished me 15 years ago, I actually forgave her. The unexpected words hung suspended in the quiet space between us, delivered not as a weak offering of reconciliation, but as a definitive, empowering release of the heavy emotional burden I had carried for far too long. I carefully clarified that my forgiveness was strictly for my own mental peace, a necessary, conscious step to thoroughly cleanse my spirit of her lingering toxic bitterness. However, I made it absolutely, unequivocally clear that letting go of the past did not equate to giving her permission to ever disrupt my life again. I looked directly at her rigidly set jaw and stated flatly that the miserable era of her controlling my narrative, aggressively dictating my worth, and attempting to publicly humiliate me to artificially inflate her own fragile ego was officially terminated. She finally snapped her head toward me, opening her mouth slightly to launch one of her signature, deeply cutting insults, but the familiar venom completely failed to materialize. The absolute, unwavering certainty reflecting in my eyes effectively silenced her before she could even articulate a single coherent syllable. She realized in that exact moment that she possessed zero remaining leverage. Her immense wealth, her carefully curated societal influence, and her weaponized maternal guilt were completely, utterly useless against the successful, highly respected reality I had painstakingly built. I took a very deep, restorative breath, feeling genuinely lighter than I had in my entire adult existence, and delivered my final, irreversible verdict. I calmly and firmly informed her that this brief, solitary interaction would be our very last earthly conversation. I explicitly stated that I was walking out of this historic estate tonight, driving back to my fulfilling reality and absolutely never returning to her destructive orbit. There would be no obligatory holiday greetings, no forced, agonizing reconciliations at future family milestones, and certainly no more exhausting attempts to win the approval of a matriarch inherently incapable of unconditional love. I watched the devastating, crushing reality of my permanent absence finally wash over her aging features, leaving a stark, defeated emptiness in its wake. Without waiting for a response or an apology that I simply no longer needed, I turned my back on her forever, stepped smoothly out into the dimly lit stone terrace, and walked away. The drive back to Richmond that night felt different from the drive up. The oppressive, suffocating anxiety that had heavily accompanied me on the dark highway earlier was entirely gone, replaced instead by a profound, sweeping sense of clarity and absolute liberation. As the miles stretched out behind me, I realized the heavy chains of familial obligation had finally snapped. Over the subsequent months, the undeniable, far-reaching fallout from that evening rippled intensely through the affluent circles of Charlottesville, effectively dismantling the flawless, superior facade my mother had spent decades meticulously curating. High-profile business partners and highly influential societal acquaintances quietly began distancing themselves, severely damaging Patricia's once untouchable prestigious reputation as they actively avoided the toxic reality that had been so publicly exposed at the reception. Even more devastating to her carefully controlled domestic empire was Brandon's newfound, unshakable independence. He drastically reduced his communication with her almost immediately after the honeymoon, limiting their contact to brief, superficial holiday updates, and firmly prioritizing the peace of his new marriage over his mother's endless, manipulative demands for attention. Hearing about her rapid social and familial decline through the grapevine brought me absolutely no joy or vindication, but it fundamentally solidified my absolute certainty that walking away permanently was the exact right choice. My definitive decision to sever ties was not a petty act of vengeance, but a necessary, unapologetic measure of extreme self-preservation. I realized that I had spent my entire adult life subconsciously hoping for a maternal redemption that was simply never going to materialize. If my incredibly painful personal journey can offer any tangible value, guidance, or comfort to anyone listening right now, let it be this undeniable, universal truth. You absolutely do not need the approval, acceptance, or validation of the very people who callously pushed you out of their lives to recognize your own profound worth. The biological family you are born into does not dictate your permanent trajectory or your value as a human being. Sometimes, the absolute most effective way to deeply heal your inner wounds is to establish unyielding, steel boundaries, step out of the toxic shadows, and bravely continue living a beautiful, successful life strictly on your own terms. Your continuous personal growth, your hard-won internal peace, and your thriving independence are the only authentic closure you will ever truly need. Thank you so much for staying with me and listening to the very end of this deeply personal chapter. If you have ever experienced a similarly destructive family dynamic or had to make the incredibly difficult choice to walk away just to save yourself, please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I read and truly appreciate every single story.